Well, hello, everybody. I'm Martha Minow, and as the Dean of Harvard Law School, it gives me great pleasure and to have the privilege of introducing this tremendous event with the amazing name that has sharks in it, and you'll hear more about that, in honor of our beloved Professor Phil Heymann. Before most of us even knew what it meant, Philip Heymann worked on how to protect liberty in an age of terror. He thought and wrote about smart policing, about the war on drugs, about the fate of public debate in the United States. Before experiential learning was a term of art in legal education, he developed simulation-based learning with case studies and role plays. Always taking on the toughest problems, Phil has always looked also for real and workable solutions. His formal bio, known to many of you, he is the James Barr Ames Professor here. He has served at high levels in both the State and Justice Departments during, are you ready, the administrations of Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Carter, and Clinton. He was Deputy U.S. Attorney General, and he survived the experience. He was a Fulbright Scholar, an undergraduate at Yale University, distinguished graduate of Harvard Law School. He also served as a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice John Harlan, Assistant U.S. Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division, Assistant to the Solicitor General in the Justice Department, Acting Administrator of the State Department's Bureau of Security and Consular Affairs, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Organizations, Executive Assistant to the Undersecretary of State, Deputy U.S. Attorney General, and Associate Prosecutor and Consultant to the Watergate Special Forces. Let me just say that means that Phil Heymann has had more work experience as one person than the rest of the faculty combined. Heymann has kept the government accountable. He's kept the government accountable when it uses force and when it enacts the system of criminal justice. He has encouraged generations of students to take up public service. His work has extended to Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Northern Ireland, the Palestinian Authority, South Africa, Russia, and places that he has not yet told me about. I have more. Jeffrey Smith, former general counsel of the CIA, said about one of Phil's book, he said, it should be read by the President and Congress, who should then move quickly to adopt as many of its suggestions as possible. Former Republican Congressman Bob Barr warned, current and future policymakers ignore this blueprint at our peril. Maybe it's because of his remarkable devotion to and his loving family. He collaborates beautifully. That's attested to by the variety of his co-authors, many of whom are here. I am privileged to be one. Do you remember? We once wrote an op-ed together. As I am privileged to be his friend. You may be surprised to learn that superstar model Heidi Klum and Phil Heymann have something in common. She once said, and I quote her, I'm not saying that everyone should swim with sharks.
Really?
But sometimes you have to jump over your own shadow in order to learn something that you will never forget for the rest of your life. Then you know you can conquer your fears. To Phil Heymann and to those who admire him, I say salute to Carol Steiker for organizing this tremendous event. Let the proceedings roll.
This will not be the type of retirement party where the longtime associates of the retiree talk about the brilliance of his writing, the wonder of his teaching. This is going to be different. The best way to describe it is that when I was about 10 or 12 years ago, my daughter Jody was living very nearby, and she said to me, I'll tell you what I'd like you to do, Dad. I'd like you to come over once a week, bring a tape recorder, we'll have lunch together, and you tell me war stories. And we'll take them at the same time, and then you can get them typed, which we did. And there are about 26 or 27 of them now. but there are another 26 or 27 to be done. And this is about first the events, and then thinking about them, and then the stories have meant. The fun, the funniness, the irritation, the absolute absurdity. That's what this is about, and this is as good a place to start on that book after retirement as any. It'll be about 50 stories. Indeed, the importance of this occasion is shown by the distance that distinguished people have sent emissaries to it. UCLA sent the Dean of the School of Public Health and the Vice Provost for Interfaculty Work, Jody Heymann, and her husband, Tim Brewer. I can almost, but not quite, forgive the Dean and Vice Provost for kidnapping to California 2 of my grandchildren. Totally unnecessary. Then, a graduate student in international relations, and Jeremy, who Google can only do without for a very short period of time. The stories we will tell, those of us up here, are so fraught with issues of lawlessness that the Department of Justice has lent us one of its best prosecutors, Stephen Heymann, with whom I've taught seminars in surveillance, organized crime, prosecution, and investigation at Harvard Law School for 20 years. I'm not at all sure we ever told you that, Martha. And Tufts sent one of its best development people, my daughter-in-law, Cindy Lubienne. Finally, Google sent its secret weapon, but I can't see him, my grandson, Paul. There he is. Okay. To choose the stories, the speakers are roughly responsible for different decades we worked together. In the 70s, Justice Breyer, who's thought a Supreme Court conference was more important than being here, and I worked on the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, and then we worked together later when he was General Counsel, Chief Counsel of the Judiciary Committee, and I was head of the Criminal Division in the Department of Justice. In the 80s, Irv Nathan, 2 down from me there, and I worked on Abscam and much else together. In the 1990s, Anna Maria Salazar and Morris Panner, the next 2 in line, worked together for years in Guatemala. In the first decade of the 2000s, Juliette, Kayyem, and I organized a stellar and broad group of practitioners and advocates to tackle what we thought of as the 10 hardest questions of counterterrorism, hardest moral questions about counterterrorism. And we proposed solutions to an interested press and public in the District of Columbia, and in a private session to a totally disinterested White House counsel and Attorney General. You will hear about the adventures of people with such grandiose, unrealistic, and yet admirable goals as ending corruption in the White House, ending corruption in Congress, stopping incredibly cruel violence in Guatemala, and fighting terrorism legally. We didn't always succeed. I've carefully chosen to leave out of the stories the adventures that is family life with my wife, children, grandchildren, and my first great-grandchild, Paul's son, Sam. I am much too private to share that part of my life, but I can say that no part of my working life and career means as much to me as my family has meant. And no one has provided more support than my wife, Ann, in encouragement, wise understanding of people and organizations, and picking up the many burdens of supporting my career. Each generation arrayed along there has shared much of their lives with us and with all of the others. We have shared our lives with them. The longest sharing by far is the life that I have shared with my wife, Ann, 62 years of marriage and probably 67 of going steady together. Through all the ages of growing up, of working out our relationship, of adventures, and of growing more and more together each year since I fell in love with her when I was 15 and she was 13. Now let's go to work. Turning to what I'm prepared to be very open about, the part of a life spent swimming and inviting my friends, people I admire, to swim with me among the sharks. All of this is accompanied by a wonderful group of risk-taking associates, some of whom you're about to meet, and my wife Anne as my consigliere. For those of you who don't speak Mafia-ese, that's someone who helped deal with Guatemala's right-wing murderer, Colonel Byron Lima, who bashed in a heroic bishop's head with a large concrete block, with the South African apartheid government's chief interrogator, who was placed next to Anne at the table, and who explained to her that he had interrogated most of the people in the room. With murdering military colonels near Naba in the Guatemalan highlands, and the consigliere also had to deal with John Allen, a beloved friend who made his living as an armed robber and visited us with a contract out on his life. On that occasion, he offered to show his guns to my much younger son, Steve, if Steve would show him his gun, which they did. And he took Jody and I went out on a car ride with him through Cambridge, and he would point at banks and say, I could take that one, I could take that one. And Jody, for some weeks afterwards, after he had left, would say, I could take that one. Okay, chivalry is not dead. I have long made it a practice not to go anywhere dangerous without my wife Anne.
It's true.
Carol.
Great. I am so delighted to be the MC of these proceedings, especially because actually Phil and I go way back as fellow MCs at the public interest auction. For many years in its early incarnations, we were joint MCs together, auctioneers. Phil always religiously wore a tux to those events, which I think everyone appreciated. Phil and I also share a deep and abiding passion for public defense, and each devoted a substantial part of our careers to it. Phil, I believe your devotion was about 11 minutes. But Phil always tells me I was a public defender. She was, briefly.
I bring it up
pretty regularly. But actually, I first got to know Phil. I had just started to teach here, and Phil Heymann, everyone knew who Phil Heymann was, and I had been a student here, though I hadn't had one of his classes, walked into my office and said, how'd you like to go to South Africa? I said, sure. Yeah, that sounds great. Phil had been doing work there. The apartheid government had fallen, and the South Africa was in the process of writing its post-apartheid constitution, and a group of women's rights and civil rights lawyers were having a conference in South Africa on women's issues relating to criminal justice under the new constitution. And someone had dropped out of the conference, and they wanted an American lawyer to come and fill in. And Phil, of course, was known to the people who were organizing this conference, and they said, can you help us? And Phil said, I'm just the person for you. So he sent me there, and it was only when I got there that I learned that the person who had dropped out was Catherine McKinnon, probably the most well-known person in the world on these issues. And instead, I could see they were polite, but when they picked, 31-year-old me up from the airport, hi, I think they disguised any disappointment very well, and it was a trip of a lifetime. So, Phil, thank you so much for that. In contrast to the unknown me in South Africa, we have an amazing panel of people who are highly distinguished. And we are actually not going to do this in chronological order, or even reverse chronological order, but we are going to start with Juliette Kayyem, because she actually needs to leave for reasons that will become apparent. And so will her husband, David Barron, a former colleague and judge on the First Circuit, who's here. Thank you both for being here, and you'll thank them too when you hear why they have to leave. Juliette is one of the nation's leading experts on Homeland Security. She served as Assistant Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security in the Obama administration, and also as Massachusetts' Homeland Security Advisor under Deval Patrick. She is the founder of Kayyem Solutions. Is it really the first or only female-owned security advising company?
One of the few, it should say.
One of the few.
Yeah.
One of the few.
Thanks for changing it, though.
Okay. One of the few. And she's a frequent commentator on these issues. You may have seen her or heard her on CNN or read her as a columnist in the Boston Globe, for which she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and most recently through her podcast and very recent book entitled Security Mom. Now, Juliette says she first met Phil by the bar at a Harvard faculty event. He got her a job. He got her a book deal for which they co-authored. She says that he then got her into trouble at recurring stages, including with various academic deans, a sitting attorney general, and a waitress at the Cambridge Common. So we will hear more. Juliette.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And Phil, thank you. I have known Phil for almost 20 years, and we have written a book together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I couldn't be more grateful to be here today, to be asked by you, Phil, to be part of this celebration. But I will have to leave early, as Carol said, and more on that later. There are many ways to describe Phil as an academic, a public servant, a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather now. He is kind and brilliant, smart and also sensitive, forgetful and also keenly focused on details. He has been at the forefront of some of the major legal issues of our time: terrorism and corruption, the war on drugs, and transparency. And as I reflect on Phil and our relationship, I struggle to find a way to come up with the right words to sufficiently sum up who he is that will give you a sense of him as a person as much as a scholar, and what he has been for me, my husband David, who he worked with for many years, and our family. And then it came to me as I went through the stories of our lives together. Phil doesn't take no for an answer. He is game, and if you are not game, he will make you see the errors of your way. And most of the time, he is right. He has, with Anne so close by his side, more than anyone outside my family, managed, supported, and embraced my career, David, and our lives. And it begins with our first meeting. I was a faculty spouse, having moved here when David got his first job at Harvard Law School. Unemployed and not happy about it after leaving a job at the Department of Justice, I probably sulked my way to David's first faculty event in September of 1999. Now, I wasn't exactly the best law student here, maybe because I never had Phil as a teacher, and so it wasn't a shock that I might have been alone at the bar at this event. Phil walked up, introduced himself. Of course, I knew who he was, and we started chatting. I had previously done work in counterterrorism, a field that Phil was already an intellectual leader in. And he said to me, "I have the best idea for you," he said when I told him of my employment status. It wasn't actually just an idea. It was Phil on a mission, maybe like sending you to South Africa. I don't remember ever actually saying much in agreement or otherwise. Phil didn't know me well, and certainly his sense of duty was from his loving characteristic to support the Harvard Law School family and their spouses. And in a few weeks, I had a position working on Homeland Security issues at the Kennedy School, invited to working groups Phil was leading, as he had the foresight to know that even in 1999, this nation would confront a threat it was not prepared to address. And Phil and I became partners on many efforts, both before and after 9/11. Looking back, I wondered if Phil knew of the challenges our country was to face, and he wanted a new generation to face those challenges with him, and to recognize that no matter the threat, there was a role for lawyers and the law. There is no ego in Phil, just a sense that we should all be game. He is always and passionately curious. I have learned other things about Phil in these years. He likes lunch, he likes legals and Indian and the midday meal generally. I don't think I've ever had a coffee with Phil, just a meal. He also can get so invested in a conversation during lunch that on more than one occasion, and certainly with me when we both walked out of Cambridge Common, that he can forget to do basic things like pay the bill. He was likely conspiring on some new project that I had just had to be game on when a young waitress came running out to tell us that whatever it was that was so interesting was far less interesting than the check and her tip. I have also learned that Phil doesn't really get when you are just in no mood to play the game. He is always sprinting. We had a book deadline, as has been mentioned, a few weeks before my son Leo was born. I thought we were done, but finished isn't exactly a place for Phil, right? It was lots of tinkering. It was May 27th, 2003, and Phil decided he did not like our introduction, and we just had to get together, and I needed to look at his new draft that he had related through his handy dictaphone immediately. That date may not seem very consequential to you, but I was scheduled to have a C-section on May 28th. It wasn't a surprise due date. It was right there on his calendar. I tried to hide from him, but somehow he convinced me that those last few hours, 9 months pregnant, would surely be best spent rewriting the introduction. And he was right. We changed the introduction, and it was better and stronger. And as we said goodbye, I did tell him, "Don't call me, I'll call you." Over the years, we have had our share of experiences where I am grateful for his kindness, if not annoyed at his capacity to shake things off. Phil and I have had our fair share of trouble, sometimes much more consequential than forgetting to pay the bills. One of our projects about the long-term legal implications of the war on terror had some unsympathetic detractors, including a dean at another school at Harvard. The controversy about what we had said about interrogation and a legal framework that was too often being ignored by those in power at the time, and what others thought we had said, led to a series of phone calls amongst several deans and angry accusations. I was horrified and nervous, and Phil reminded me that there was a benefit for him having tenure. He never lost his cool, calmly explaining our efforts, and then emailing me separately various insults to make me laugh and to say he has been around the block a few times. Very insults about them, not us. He was game, and even if I'd wanted to run from the game, he wouldn't let me. And let me take an aside and talk about those emails, because I see some of these faces in there. I have never seen Phil actually write an email. Various courageous faculty assistants played the role for him, and for them I am grateful too. But if Phil is game for anything, it is fundamentally his love for his family and their children and grandchildren and now a great-grandchildren fill so much of his conversations. You must know that for any of us who work with Phil. The year his grandson finished high school while residing with him provided great joy for Phil and a lot of humor for Phil's friends. He loves traveling with his family and is so proud of all of his children. I sometimes hear Phil talk of Anne and believe that the greatest legacy he has left me is a sense that should you find someone in your life who can be your partner, then nurture it. Play that game like your life depended on it. And so I want to end with one moment when Phil's enthusiasm and sense that life isn't meant to be dull came full speed. It was the summer of 2013. David and I had just returned from serving in jobs in D.C., and Phil and I had kept our relationship up, including David and I celebrating with Anne and him his 80th birthday. A few weeks later, I had asked Phil to, of course, lunch at Legal Seafoods, as I was considering and being considered for a foray into politics, a life plan I had never intended. I was torn and did not know if I should do it. I remarked on this and about other candidates in the field and money and the pressures, and then Phil stopped me short, and he said something that got me to forget my doubts and take a leap. And I have no idea all this background stuff you are talking about, he said. All I know is what my 80-year-old self would tell my 45-year-old self. You will not get this time again. Phil, you have lived those words. You have lived knowing that one day your 80-plus-year-old self would look back and make sure he would be proud of the life and love and career he had created through successes and even those that fall short. You have always been game, and I look forward to seeing the next one. But on that front, I need to excuse myself and David, who sits here now and who has also benefited from Phil's help at the school on various committees and during David's confirmation hearing. It seems fitting that the day before Leo was born, you insisted I keep playing. Tomorrow is Leo's bar mitzvah. And maybe it is a great coincidence that the night before each of his moments, so to speak, Leo's birth and his entry into adulthood, that I have been honored to get one more round with you, Phil. So the pleasure has been mine, and the privilege has been life-changing. I love you, Phil.
Thanks so much, Juliette. Mazel tov to you both. Well, that's a hard act to follow. I think we'll make Justice Stephen Breyer follow that. Let's get him up on the video screen. He's a man who truly needs no introduction.
Hi, Phil. I'm really sorry I can't be up there with you today. I'd love to be. But I have been thinking over how long a time it's been, really, since we've been friends. And I've thought of the different roles you've played during that long friendship. You know, the first time I ever heard of you, was of Phil Heymann, the third-year paper writer. That was because Paul Freund, I think, or some other great teacher, was using your paper as an example of what every third-year student should write. And I can remember the paper, I think it was about ice cream. Now, what it had to do with ice cream, I couldn't tell you, but that's what sticks in my mind from that. Then, of course, there was Phil Heymann, the legend. Now, I tried to pursue that idea when I taught administrative law. I would ask my students, how did Phil Heymann ever become an assistant secretary of state? And I think the answer went something like this, that Abba Schwartz, friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, was appointed to be assistant secretary of state by Dean Rusk, and he suddenly, great liberal that he is, realized that he had working for him Frances Knight, who was the foreign affairs equivalent of J. Edgar Hoover. She was known among liberals as the Dragon Lady. And he thought, well, she works for me. I'll transfer her to Idaho. And so she basically lost her job. Well, the shortest time ever measured was between the instance that he said to her, you're going to lose her job, and her firing him. Because she, of course, went right to the Hill. And that was the end of Abba Schwartz. And I think wasn't that the time that Dick Katzenbach came over to state to try to clear up this mess, and others, and you accompanied him. And that is how you got your job. That's at least my impression. Then there is Phil Heymann, the practical lawyer, genius expert. That was when we drove in every part of that summer when we were working for Archie Cox at Watergate. And I remember that you one day said, you know, what are we going to do if Archie gets Judge Sirica to issue a subpoena for the tapes? And the president won't give him the tapes, but he doesn't appeal, he just doesn't give him the tapes. Then what do we do? Archie can't appeal, he won. And we were worried about that. And it was a good point, because years later I asked Charles Allen Wright, who had been representing the president, why didn't the president do that? And he said, well, they thought about it. And they decided, however, that it would be a bad idea because it would undercut the rule of law. So you certainly, and others working for Watergate, did help preserve that rule of law during that summer and the next year. And I think that was a remarkable achievement, very helpful to the country. Then, of course, there is Phil Heymann, the genius. The genius who, with I don't know whom in the Justice Department, dressed everybody in the criminal division, or maybe not everybody, but quite a few, dressed them up as Arab sheiks and sent them over to the Senate to try to work out which senators were and which senators weren't basically honest. Well, I don't know about that idea, but it seemed to work out all right and led to a few prosecutions, and I gather a few movies later on. Very interesting. There was, of course, Phil Heymann, the genius teacher. There we were, you and I, who thought at that early period that law students should know how to operate in the world of public policy. We always had a practical aspect to what we were trying to teach. So what you did was you organized that the Kennedy School teachers, Rayford, Schelling, Dick Neustadt, Steinbrunner, Jake Jacoby, Zeckhauser, Dick Light would come over, and we'd all teach the students something about public policy, about economics, about statistics, decision theory. It was great, actually. It was one of the great courses of all time. Now, perhaps, unfortunately, the students didn't seem to like it too much, except for two, namely you and me. And we both learned more in that course, I think, than we've learned in most others that we've taken, and perhaps some that we've taught. Then I'm afraid I have to mention Phil Heymann, the impractical politician. Now, that was Phil Heymann when, through the machinations of, I think, someone called Ava Abramowitz, who was on my staff when I worked in the Senate, got the bright idea that when you were head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, you were doing such a good job that the Senate should have hearings to look into how you were doing. I do remember my thought. This is not a wise idea. If you are doing a good job, keep doing it. Don't ask the United States Senate to look into it. But nonetheless, somehow there ended up a whole set of hearings. Quite a few senators were there. You were testifying, and there was a person called Nard, I think, who was a friend of one of the senators who thought that the FBI man had been behaving very badly in something he was involved in. And all I can remember is you thought, when you were asked that question, that it was so ridiculous that you would respond in a somewhat sarcastic way and said something like, and yes, and after that the FBI man burned up the haystacks in the field. Now, I knew that was meant to be a joke, but not everybody did. And I remember myself sitting there waving my hands wildly, meaning, don't pursue this. And I do remember the chairman, Senator Biden, saying, "That's a joke. He means that as a joke." And all I know, somehow the session ended. We were all convinced you'd done a great job. But you didn't have to have hearings in order to convince us of that, because we already knew it. Well, we've stayed friends all these years. It's been wonderful for me. I've learned much for you. I think we enjoy each other's company. I think we think much the same thoughts in much the same way. And it will be fun, and will continue to be fun, I certainly hope, for many years in the future. Have a lovely, great celebration.
Well, that's great. It seems that he does agree that you've taught him everything he knows.
Didn't I say that?
Yes, always. So now we turn to Morris Panner. Morris, who, when he was here at Harvard, was the founding editor of the Harvard Human Rights Law Journal, which continues to this day. And he was also the first director of the Guatemala office of the Harvard Center for Criminal Justice under Phil's leadership. Morris later served as an AUSA in the Southern District of New York, and then in Bogota, Colombia, as resident legal advisor, and in Washington, D.C. as principal deputy to the narcotics section. He served on the board of the Washington Office for Latin America, a leading human rights organization, and serves on the board of Drug Strategies, a leading research institute on drug policy. An experienced entrepreneur as well, he is CEO of DICOM Grid, a digital health company, and he invests in and serves on the boards of healthcare and software companies. Now, Phil says that Morris introduced him to the world's most corrupt border. Which one is that, Phil? There are a lot that can vie for that title.
Where Guatemala meets Honduras.
And what happened at that that border?
What you do is you drive up, and there's a row of about 6 offices, separate buildings, and that's on the Guatemalan side. And your driver goes in and pays money to someone in each of the 6 Guatemalan offices. Then you drive a little further, and there's 6 offices on the Honduran side, and the driver drives up and pays money to each of them. Well, to do that, you have to have some money, and I was a little bit worried whether I had enough money. And so I pulled out my wallet. This, by the way, looks like a scene from a Western movie. Everybody has a gun. Everybody's sort of slouching around. It looks like if you live the next 15 minutes, you're doing well. I pulled out my wallet and decided to count my money. I didn't know whether I was going to be shot first by one of the gunmen on the street or first by Anne, who said, "Put away your money! Put away your money!" But anyway, that's the scene. It's where they filmed many realistic shootings for movies.
Okay, that sets the scene, Morris. We'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Phil. And happily, Anne was there at the border. And that's why we're here today. It all kind of worked out that way. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to toast Phil, to be with you all, to be with Anne and the family. It is, as said, his finest achievement, accomplishment, and love. So it really is appropriate that that's where everything starts and ends. And we're going to split the time, Anna Marie and I, which is also pretty appropriate because we worked together on all these projects for years, and we still seem to work together. And it's been a really nice run in that way. But let me go back to the beginning for a second, because it started when I was a student here. And we wanted to start a law journal about human rights. We were really excited about it, and we needed faculty support. And as has been said, Phil was a very open person, went to the office, a little intimidating because of all the things that we all knew he had done. And we said, "Would you be supportive of this idea?" And he said, "Absolutely." He said, "I would, though, ask you to consider whether the world really does need another law journal." And that was sort of Phil in a nutshell. He was endlessly supportive of whatever you wanted to do. But he also had an approach to law and to life that was not just writing about it, but you really had to do it. And, what I think is kind of neat about that is it really did connect directly to working on the Harvard Center for Criminal Justice. Because a lot of people might have turned that into a theoretical organization or done something that published papers. And not Phil. He would be at the Honduran border bribing, apparently, public officials in multiple countries. The statute of limitations has passed, so it's open season. But that was really my introduction to how the life of the law could be experienced. And my favorite painting here is Oliver Wendell Holmes. And when you see Phil, you see the logical result of how Harvard Law School can produce the very best in activists for all the good senses. And when Phil started the Center for Criminal Justice, it was really a revolutionary idea. And Paul would recognize this concept. It was to do a minimum viable product in the area of legal reform. And for entrepreneurs, the minimal viable product is the gold standard, because what happens when you try to do something new is you get so caught up in doing the perfect, you never do anything. You get so caught up in trying to figure it out, you delay, because it's kind of scary. Phil didn't delay. He launched something. He was one of the pioneers in the administration of justice. And the administration of justice, interestingly enough, has its roots, and this shows that I did go to law school, in the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. And in 1985, Congress, in a bipartisan way, said, we're going to start a program. And Phil became the incarnation of that program. And I'm quite confident they never would have given Phil the mandate to do it if they knew what he was planning to do. What they thought he was going to do was hold academic sessions where he would train judges and look at texts and generally, and I could tell this was happening because whenever they talked to him, they'd call him professor. And that drove Phil crazy. And so the quickest way to get him upset in these meetings was to have a State Department official say, now, professor, and he would turn green and get all angry. And then Anne would say something like, really? And then that was the key to move on. What Phil did was he set up a series of pilot courts in really, truly the middle of nowhere, Guatemala. And I remember the indication of this. I was rolling around there, and they were going to inaugurate one of these. Phil came, and then the U.S. ambassador was going to come and inaugurate the place. And they said, but it's too dangerous for the U.S. ambassador to go there except by helicopter. We're going to have to helicopter him in, set up a whole security perimeter. I'm like, I walk around here every day. I think it's going to be fine, you know. And they're like, no. And as we're driving along, and Phil's in the car, I see a truck pull behind us, you know, kind of blocking the exit. And then I see further along a truck kind of pull out in front, and I think, this is it. They're really right. You know, we're all going to be. And it just turns out it's Guatemala where trucks break down on the road, and there's, you know, no problem. But Phil is kind of like, He says, I think there's an 80% chance this works out just fine. And there were some other good moments, too. So we were meeting with a prosecutor. And the prosecutor, we had this was a perfect case. And the prosecutor said, it's a very good case. It's a really good case. We went over the whole facts, and Phil said, you know, that's very well done, and we've been working on preservation, chain of evidence. And he said, I kept it all just as it was supposed to be. And Phil said, that's great. And then he said, and there's one more thing. It's even better. Phil said, what do you mean it's even better? He said, well, I took additional evidence that I had in the evidence locker, and I put it at the scene so it would be very clear that all of this would be perfectly set up for you. Phil handled that with aplomb. We didn't pursue that case, but he was, you know, we kind of moved on. There was the judge who was investigating one of the president's circles for corruption, who felt it would only be appropriate to call her cousin the president to give her an update on where the investigation was going. There were the students actually here at the law school. What Phil did was somewhat courageous because many people thought what was happening was a little bit of a cover. In other words, they were taking Phil's good name and Harvard's good name, and they were using it to sort of whitewash over the Contras. None of this was helped, actually, by the fact that for a brief moment in time, Oliver North and I both worked for the same organization, sort of unbeknownst to each other, but they had set this up kind of in parallel. But Phil really wasn't that, and a lot of people said a lot of mean things. And what I loved about Phil was these were people who knew him, and they were human rights advocates, and they got pretty heated about it. And he was really sweet about it. He didn't like it, but he never took it personally. And he sort of understood it as something where people disagree about things they care about. And you could do that with Phil without ever, losing either his, I don't know about respect, but it never lost the civility, which I think is something that is kind of lost today sometimes in the way the debate continues. And then the sort of last piece is really, it's true that we would travel extensively with Anne. And one of the things I loved about traveling with Anne was you don't really understand Phil until you see the interaction with Anne. It's like watching, I don't know what the right analogy is, but it's like, watching Facebook without Sheryl Sandberg. There has to be a COO. There has to be someone with all the great, ideas, and then there has to be someone with common sense. And there has to be someone with compassion. And what was nice about this was when Anne was in any situation, she was always so A, practical, and so that helps. But then B, you could see where Phil's sense of compassion and view of the world was shaped. And it was really a joy. We always I loved it, and it was an unusual privilege to see them interact that way, because I don't think everybody did. They are private people. They didn't do that. It's just this was work, and you could see their interaction on display in that way. So the legacy of all this is actually a pretty serious legacy. Phil changed the way people did administration of justice. It would have never gone this way. And in fact, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on training an unending number of judges in things that they will never use, prosecutors, defense lawyers. But now the gold standard is really what Phil set up, which is a practical application. he also set up something super important, which is that he had the ability to quit when it was time to leave. And he held the Guatemalans to a high standard. He was compassionate, he was understanding. But at some point, the Guatemalan government made it clear they weren't serious. And Phil left. Not in kind of a huffy way, but just said, here was the goals, here was the criteria, didn't do it, and we gotta go. And what was interesting is there's a young woman named Claudia Paz, who was a prosecutor back then in that judicial tower. And she just finished being the Attorney General of Guatemala. Very brave woman who did a lot of really brave things. And Claudia remembers this. And she said, we were really sad that you guys left. I talked to her not long ago about this. And she said, we're really sad that you left because it was so wonderful to have you. And it was kind of hopeful for us. But we were also really proud because it showed that we, by extension, couldn't be bought. And that we could be independent. And that we could be strong. And that, in some ways, inspired her to continue on. She said, I was a very anonymous person in this big tower in Guatemala. It's a ridiculously sort of large judicial tower. And you're in the tower, and she was there kind of anonymously toiling away, but it inspired her and led her to that path. And then the last piece is that it all kind of did circle back to human rights. And one of the things that Phil managed to do was shift the way human rights advocates thought of themselves in this world of kind of failed states. And in the old days, human rights was pretty simple. You protested against the man. And now there is no man. There's nothing. I mean, it's just chaos. And these human rights organizations have kind of adopted the mantra of what Phil did, which is build something so that there can be some institutional presence, and that's so important. So you start seeing it has come full circle to the person who told me, please don't do another law journal, or at least he suggested that, to really having a big impact on how human rights is written about in that law journal now. And I think it is a very important piece. So, Phil, the good news is that you may be retiring from the law school, but you're certainly not retiring from all of these adventures and all of the important work to do. And I think that I got an email not long ago about drug policy, so that I know this work, Mathea Falco, and the work of those various groups is going to continue on, and both here in the United States and globally. So, a toast to you, and I'd like to introduce Ana Maria Salazar. Carol, do you want to?
Yes, give me just a minute to elaborate on your introduction of Ana Maria, who is herself a widely recognized expert on international law and national security in Latin America. She, too, holds a JD from HLS and served as policy advisor for President Clinton's special envoy for the Americas, and after that as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Drug Enforcement Policy and Support at the Pentagon. In Colombia, she served as the judicial attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Bogota and played a key role in developing the $1.3 billion support package for Colombia that was signed by President Clinton in June 2000. Ana Maria is a frequent guest on English and Spanish television and radio news and talk shows on a wide variety of legal issues and has been recognized with awards too many to mention. But Phil says that Ana Maria is most famous for sneaking onto a Guatemalan airbase when the Department of State wanted nothing more than decorum from the HLS project that Phil was running there. Phil, how did you prevent Ana Maria from being arrested as a spy?
Well, you're assuming I wanted to prevent her from being arrested.
Thank you, and I'll explain exactly how I got out of that. And I swear, Phil, I didn't do it on purpose. It's a lesson for everybody. Don't hang out with people who've graduated from Harvard Business School, which is what happened. I was walking around, and she wanted to buy a plane. It was literally, she had graduated from Harvard Business School. She was a Guatemalan, and she wanted to buy a little plane. So she goes, let's go to the airport and walk around and look at these planes. And I go, oh, fine. So we walked into the Air Force Base. And I will tell you how we were arrested. We almost thought they were going to disappear us, but I'll tell you what happened in a couple of minutes. So this all comes down to what I think should be the title of your book, Phil. The title of your book should be Legal Warriors, or the General of Legal Warriors, because you have, because of your inspiration, because of your work, have inspired legal warriors not only here from the law school, around the world. People who are willing to go out, and when we think of warriors, you think of people who are going out in wars. Well, we do have people who worked out in these projects that literally were working in warlike situations where you have this ultimate faith that the law is going to defend you, that at the end of the day, even if it's a war going on, because we had a project in Guatemala at the time where we'd just been out of a warlike situation. In Colombia, we also worked together. We worked together in Mexico, in some of the issues which, as you know, there are parts of Mexico that are in a warlike situations. And what happens is, even at the worst of, when you see the worst of humanity, where people are killing each other, you need lawyers, you need these legal warriors to come and be there, because you have to believe that at one point, if you have these rules of engagement, eventually people will stop killing each other, or they'll stop torturing each other. And eventually, with these rules of engagement, with the law, eventually the people will be prosecuted and they'll be punished. And eventually, with these rules, you will have a system in which people will be able to resolve their conflicts in courts and not on the streets. I mean, that's ultimately what these legal warriors do. And that's what you did throughout the years. there's hundreds of legal warriors, thousands, I could bet, just counting the number of people that came to Harvard at these meetings, because it's this idea that, in many ways, and you mentioned it, Morris, that people were afraid that we would abuse of Harvard's good name or of Phil's good name. And I have to tell you, and I'll tell you, particularly in this situation, Harvard in many ways protects people from getting killed. When we were detained by these two thugs who had accused us of walking into the military base, we kind of looked at him, and he said, "Who are you?" And they kind of pushed us around, and I'm like, wait, hold on a second. Let's just... And they didn't let us make any phone calls. I have to say, I've done a lot of dangerous things in my life, but this was clearly the scariest one, because nobody knew that we were there. And they had been disappearing people. So we kept on telling them who we were. I was extremely concerned about this Harvard business graduate, because they still were killing people at the time. So we tried to explain who we are, and they kept on accusing me of being a U.S. spy and this and that, and called the U.S. Embassy. I'm not a spy. I work for Harvard. And this thug kind of looked at me and goes, "Harvard?" I go, "Yeah, Harvard. Proyecto de Harvard." And he looked at me, "Harvard." And they're kind of whispering on each other, "Heymann?" "Yeah, Phil Heymann." "Heymann?" And there was Harvard. "Heymann? Heymann?" "Yes, Phil Heymann." They were more concerned about me working with Phil Heymann than I was working with the U.S. government. So I'm like, we got to work on this. So I go, "Yeah, Phil Heymann." Phil Heymann. Okay, so finally they let me make a phone call. And this is where, everything that I learned about Phil it really mattered. The first thing I did is I called a judge. It was one of the judges that we were working with. We would go to the crime scenes with him. This is at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I called him, I woke him up, and I go, "Come on, get up." He goes, "Oh, Ana Maria, there's no crime scene. There's no dead people in Guatemala tonight. There's nothing to do tonight." I said, "Get up, get up." He says, "What do you want?" "I'm requesting a habeas corpus over the form." He goes, "What?" He goes, "Yes. The Guatemalan Constitution says in Article 23 that if you're detained for more than 6 hours by anybody, you can request a habeas corpus." He goes, "Where are you?" "I'm on a military base. It's the air base." He goes, "Nobody's ever done this before." I go, "Well, you're going to get up, and you're going to get me out of here." So this man, I think it was the first time in Guatemalan history that they had a civilian judge come into a military base and take a civilian out. And of course, this is all under this utmost faith that if you believe in the law, you can save lives. And he did it. He came in, he walked in. We were all so scared. I have to say, I even kept that shirt I was wearing that night, because, if you ever worked in these types of jobs, you know what fear smells like. You can smell it. Well, I kept that shirt for a long time. But this is what I learned from Phil, that you have to have this utmost trust that if we can get people to follow the the rules of law, you can stop wars, you can stop people from killing each other, and ultimately you can prosecute and punish people who have done very evil things in the world. And part of these projects, and Morris mentioned a couple of them, where we would get these people together. It's not only the high-level officials, but it was those officials that we thought that if we could somehow give them that protection, a little bit of Harvard law, we could somehow make sure that if they were going to try to hurt them, they would think about it the way they thought about, oh God, these thugs they were actually colonels at this Air Force base. But they also, what we did with many of these projects that Morris didn't mention, was we tried to teach also how we need to treat each other, kind of standards of the law. And I'm sure, Phil, you don't remember this, but when we started out with these programs, part of my role was to do a lot of translation, bring coffee, take notes. And judges from Guatemala, really, especially the men judges, did not treat the female staff very well. And they would be ordering around. They would be actually pretty rude to us. So at one point, I remember when I'd been translating for 3 or 4 hours for Phil, and he stood up and said, and Phil looked at me, and he kind of looked at me, and he said, Ana Maria, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. Do you take milk? And I remember those judges kind of looking at me, like, God, there's this Harvard professor bringing this creature coffee. And that idea, and for women who've been in the professional realm, I know what I'm talking about. This whole thing of the politics of who brings the coffee, it's a huge deal. And for him to do that, my role in this project changed automatically. He goes, oh yeah, she's been working 4 hours. Can I bring you some coffee? That changed everything. And I have to say, it also just reminded me that when we do things around the world, we also have to show how we change, the way you treat people does matter. We did a conference in Guatemala on corruption. I don't know if you remember this. And at one point, we were bringing in people from all over Guatemala, from some women, some indigenous people who worked with the indigenous tribunals, and they were trying to get into the hotel. They would not let them in the hotel because they didn't let brown people into that hotel in Guatemala City. And of course, we ran all out, and it's just like, just reminded, we have to, the way we do things has to be an example, even the way we treat people. And that was in a very part. So not only are we encouraging people to believe in the law, but we have to encourage people that there's different ways of treating each other. And one of the things that Morris mentioned was the way we encouraged people around the world. And Phil had he would bring in people together to talk to and encourage not only Guatemalan judges, Colombian judges and prosecutors, but also Mexicans, that you can do it. And we would try to he would bring in these wonderful examples of how things can be done. And he did bring in Giovanni Falcone to Guatemala, which he was, and I know many of you may not remember him, but he was a judge that was able to combat the mafia at the time quite successfully. And he brought them in, and he did. And I remember that meeting. He was just like, you can do it. You have to do it for your country. You have to do it for your kids. You cannot let these people get away with this. Well, Giovanni was killed about, 2 years later? He was murdered, him and his wife. They blew up his car. But it was these types of examples that we were able to bring in people. Phil brought in recently some Mexican officials, and one of them, at the time, was the Attorney General for Mexico City. He is a very likely candidate to be one of the possible presidents for Mexico, presidential candidate, and he could be president of Mexico next. So this ability of bringing as an example, but also encouraging people to be legal warriors, to believe in the law, I think is one of Phil's big, wonderful, extraordinary legacies around the world. I mean, this is a legacy. I'm not going to say, Phil, that you were the one who, based on those projects in Guatemala, that we're able to, prosecute and make sure the president of Guatemala was, and who is currently in jail, is being prosecuted. But clearly, those projects, 20 years or 25 years, the same thing in Colombia in the peace process. I mean, all of these projects in which you bring in people from outside and you let outsiders come either to Harvard or to have access to this idea that the law is important and that you have to use the law. It's the only way that you can assure democracies in the world. For us, is not a new idea. But up until very recently, it was. And the US government would not support these types of projects. I'd like to leave a couple, just one more, just comment in two more stories about Phil. When Phil was at the Attorney General's office, Deputy Attorney General, he at one point suggested to Janet Reno that he should meet Ana Maria Salazar. And you'll find out why this was so important. And Janet Reno did listen to him and called me in. At that point, I was the person in charge of the evidence exchange program with Pablo Escobar and the cartel. Very dangerous job in Colombia. I was the first judicial attaché. And this was the kind of things Phil would do for his legal warriors, try to make sure that people connected. So I walk into Janet Reno's office. We have a very nice conversation. And she kind of looked at me and she goes, Ana Maria, I'm listening to what you're saying. Are you safe? And I kind of looked at her and go, ma'am, I said, that's the first time anybody has asked me that in the last 5 years. And she goes, really? I said, really. And that, those kind of encounters where we were allowed to have access to other people to be able to do our jobs was very important, not only for someone like me, but for other legal warriors. So I don't know, Phil. You've always encouraged us to question, because I have followed you. I've to question what is being said, to question authority. The last time I called Phil was because I was one of the first talking heads to call Donald Trump an idiot on TV, and I literally said it that way. He had just come out as a candidate, and he started talking about Mexicans the way he did. So I started getting a lot of phone calls from CNN. And I started saying, so I said, es un idiota. And I just said it right out. So then I started saying, well, I better back this up with something. So my last call was with Phil, was kind of showing this clip. I said, Phil, can I kind of put together some kind of hate speech argument here? And he goes, no, you can't put a hate speech argument. But this is also kind of having that ability to be able to contact. And I know it's not only me, but he has all these legal warriors around the world trying to get his advice on these constant battles. I feel that around the world, there's probably a lot of very, very corrupt officials and dictators and human rights violators and heads of cartels who are probably really, really happy thinking that you're retiring. But you know what? They're wrong, because we know you're continuing to work on this. You've left a legacy of legal warriors around the world that will continue to follow you as an example and your work. So before we end, I want to show you what happened one of the first days that when I first met Phil Heymann, and he said, "Can you speak Spanish?" I was a law student. I was a first-year law student, very lost. Not only was I a law student, but I was very lost. And he said, "Do you speak Spanish?" I go, "Yes." He goes, "Really well?" "Yeah, really well." In fact, I barely speak English. Right? My mother language is Spanish. I go, "Oh, well, this is good." I said, and I asked him, "Phil, how do you do these programs without speaking Spanish?" He goes, "Well, I look for people like you." I said, I remember being a law student. I said, "Oh my gosh, this is so cool. I'm going to be the voice of this Harvard professor." And this is what used to happen almost in every meeting. Watch. Here, Phil. Let's go. So, watch closely. Buenas tardes. Hey, tú. No soy profesor. ¿Qué? ¿Me estás llamando profesor? Cállate. ¿Cómo? No. ¿Qué dijo? Eres un corrupto. Eres un violador de derechos humanos. Cállate. No. Muchas gracias. And my last comment is for Anne. And I really appreciate all your love and your concern, and above all, the fact you were there through all these meetings. You were the voice of sanity. Every time we would do one of these acts, I would look at Anne and figuring out whether we had done the right thing, and she would sometimes look at us and go, "Do this," and we knew that perhaps we should just rephrase what we said. You were the voice of sanity of everything we did. It was wonderful to make sure that, and to have you there all the time. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Phil.
So is it okay if we? Okay, so there's one piece left, which is a little controversial. We asked if we could bring a gift, and Carol appropriately said, "We really don't want gifts. So if you have a gift, you can do it later. But when you see this,
Let's do it.
All right. You want me to read it in English and you'll translate?
Yes,
or
I will.
you wanna-
Yes, no, you read it and I'll translate.
Okay. All right. So for those of you who can't see it, this is a picture. I don't think Phil has seen this yet. Have you seen it?
Uh-huh.
Oh,
Yeah. So this is a photo of Anna Maria and I throwing. Well, actually, we can just read it.
Great, go for it.
To lead the charge on judicial reform in Guatemala, the U.S. government smartly called on Philip B. Heymann, an experienced prosecutor with a deft touch for diplomacy.
They were so thrilled when they saw this picture. We're actually throwing Phil into a volcano in Costa Rica. And I had this framed in the Pentagon, and a couple Pentagon officials went, "Oh, is that Phil Heymann?" And I go, "Yeah." "What are you doing?" "Throwing into a volcano."
But wait, in the program, success was elusive, even with the support of Supreme Court President Edmundo Vasquez Martinez, that is, the Supreme Court President. But we pressed on. Still, we all have our limits. Here we are trying to throw Phil into a volcano in Costa Rica. Happily, our plan failed, and Phil went on to serve at the various highest levels of the U.S. Justice Department and revolutionized U.S. judicial reform. So this is from the Guatemala team. This is the Supreme Court in Guatemala. This is our little joint effort. And there is the,
Thank you very, very much. Oh my God, you are trying to do it. It's a wonderful picture.
Great. And last in our lineup, before we get to hear from Phil again, but not least, is Irv Nathan, who's senior counsel at Arnold & Porter, and who has had a long and distinguished career in government service, most recently as Attorney General for the District of Columbia, but also as General Counsel of the U.S. House of Representatives, Principal Associate Deputy Attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, and Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Enforcement in the Criminal Division. In his more than 35 years in the private practice of law, Irv has represented U.S. senators, U.S. congressmen, a sitting cabinet member, a secretary of the Navy, the commissioner of baseball, and CEOs and CFOs of Fortune 500 companies, among others. He also gave Phil some memorable legal advice. When Phil was working in the Justice Department, he had the sense that Janet Reno was not his biggest fan. And 3 weeks before Reno asked Phil to resign, Phil discussed his concerns with Irv that Phil's, and Janet Reno's disagreement over a commutation for convicted spy Jonathan Pollard was getting pretty hot. Irv assured Phil that really Janet Reno was just worried about Phil, worried that he might be getting in trouble with the Clinton White House. And Phil, when he went to meet with Janet Reno, said, I think I know where this is coming from. I think it's because you're concerned that I might get in trouble with the Clinton White House. And Janet Reno's response was, "Are you kidding? You've got to be kidding." No, and she fired him. So I hope that Irv gave better advice to the many people that he has represented over the years. Irv.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. As was just suggested, I was very privileged to serve as the assistant to Phil Heymann when he was the Assistant Attorney General in the Carter administration and when he was the Deputy Attorney General in the Clinton administration. I don't remember the things exactly the way Phil does. His tenure at the Criminal Division did not start off so well. In fact, the first time he drove in to D.C. with two law students in tow, he crashed his truck into the garage doors, and like any good mentor, he immediately blamed the two passengers for the problem. And then the first thing he did was he commissioned efficiency expert Dick Darman to study the Criminal Division and make organizational recommendations. Darman strongly recommended that Phil hire no special assistants and rely entirely on the staff, the career staff. So Phil promptly hired 5 special assistants, right out of law school, none of whom had any criminal experience. And this would have been barely noticed except for the fact that William Safire, who was a columnist for the New York Times and dedicated to proving that all administrations were as corrupt as the Nixon administration in which Safire had served, would be the same. And he decided to focus his venom on the Carter Department of Justice and the Heymann Criminal Division in particular. I brought with me today a column that Safire wrote in February of 1979. It's called Mr. Clean Becomes Mr. Chips. And what it says is that it asks the question, what would happen if you put a highly ethical, absent-minded professor, beloved by his students, in charge of the criminal division? And it concluded that such an office would end up, and I'm quoting, a citadel of personal rectitude and a demoralized morass of prosecutorial ineptitude. Not a good beginning. But the thing that Mr. Heymann most resented was being called an absent-minded professor. And so he came into a staff meeting and he was complaining, this characterization is wholly unwarranted. Am I absent? No, I'm not an absent-minded professor. So later that day, we were racing down the hall to a meeting, and a reporter from a weekly news magazine ran into us, and she asked if she could interview Phil. And he said he'd be pleased to do that, pleased to give an interview, but he was too busy right now, but she could call him at home. So logically, she said that would be fine. She said, what's your home number? And the blank stare on Phil's face definitely disproved that he was an absent-minded professor. Now, most of those special assistants have gone on to great glory in the law, including other distinguished law professors, a legal publisher. And the special assistants did great work, and they looked after Phil. One was particularly worried about Phil's cigar smoking. This is a day that hasn't been mentioned, that Phil in those days would smoke cigars. And the special assistant urged Phil to see a doctor about it and said this wasn't going to be good. So Phil did see the doctor, and he reported back, and his doctor daughter might be interested in this. And so the assistant said, well, Phil, what did the doctor say? And Phil said, well, the doctor said that cigar smoking would be very bad for my health. And with that, Phil lit up another cigar, and the assistant said, what's going on? And Phil said, I got a new doctor. Once I joined the crowd, Phil was a great defender of mine. He put me in charge of the organized crime section, the narcotics section, and the appellate section. The head of the appellate section was a brilliant lawyer named Bill Bryson, who is now a judge on the federal circuit. Bill told me that one day he was walking down the halls of justice, and he was carrying 2 thick books of Fed Second, and he ran into Phil. And Phil said, are you taking those into the men's room for some light reading? And Bill said, no, that damn Nathan, he actually wants to see the cases that we're citing in our brief, and I'm taking the books to him. And then Bryson said, and that Nathan is treating me like an associate at his old law firm. And ever my defender, Phil said, that's not true. He's not treating you like an associate. He's treating you like the assistant librarian at the law firm. So we had a number of victories in the criminal division. We succeeded in convicting a number of high-placed organized crime figures in New York, Boston, New Orleans, Chicago. Phil testified about that one day, and he mentioned that we had put a damper in the Mafia and the La Cosa Nostra, and as soon as he said it, he realized that this would not please the Attorney General, who was Ben Civiletti, who said, I don't want any references to LCN or La Cosa Nostra or Mafia. And so Phil, when he went back, he went to right to Civiletti's office and said, you know, I couldn't explain about organized crime without mentioning a Mafia or LCN. And with just one phrase, Civiletti said, I could. That was one event happened when we, under our leadership, the FBI successfully used the asset forfeiture laws to acquire the businesses of a corrupt individual in D.C., and then the FBI proceeded to run those businesses until we could sell them off. Unfortunately, one of those businesses was a strip club that was not far from the Department of Justice. This obviously did not escape the press's notice. What did escape their notice was that many of those young special assistants that Phil brought had to test out the strip club. Luckily, Phil was never spotted there. We had a number of successful undercover operations. One was called Gray Lord, which involved corrupt criminal judges in Chicago, took bribes from lawyers, and they would then dismiss the charges against their clients. This all went well in the federal courts, where we brought the charges and where the state judges were convicted. It didn't go so well in the state's appellate courts, however, because those judges were upset that we never told them that we were setting up phony cases in the trial courts and taping the meetings with the trial judges. And these higher state court judges were so upset, they threatened to revoke the bar licenses of the U.S. Attorney in Chicago and us as well. We had to go out there and apologize and promise this wouldn't happen again. But of course, as has been mentioned, the premier undercover operation during that time was ABSCAM, which, as you heard, involved FBI agents. There weren't people from the criminal division, but FBI agents dressed as rich Arab sheiks handing out $50,000 bribes, which were being secretly videotaped to a senator and a congressman and assorted local officials. You may have seen the movie version if you saw American Hustle. American Hustle had in it Amy Adams and Jennifer Lawrence. I assure you there was nobody that looked like that. It was in the operation. The principal operative was a pot-bellied, cigar-chomping, fast-talking con artist named Mel Weinberg. He was played by Christian Bale. He had been convicted of stock swindles and was working off his sentence by cooperating with the government. He was an incorrigible con artist, as the movie showed. Even during the operation, he was taking kickbacks in cash from some of the middlemen. He took a microwave. He had a book contract and a movie contract. And Phil, who, of course, is no fool, he left it to me to deal with Mel Weinberg and to tell him that he had to knock this off and stop the shenanigans because he was going to be a witness and he would be cross-examined. So needless to say, I was not a favorite of Mr. Weinberg. Weinberg is now 90 years old, and he was a consultant on the movie American Hustle. And you may have noticed that the Christian Bale character, who was a Jewish con artist modeled on Mel Weinberg, was not called Mel, and he was not called Phil. His name in the movie was Irv, and I consider this no coincidence, and I have Phil to thank for that. During ABSCAM, Phil commented more than once that he noticed that all the congressmen and the senators who were coming into the operation were Democrats. And when near the end of the operation, some middlemen brought into the operation a Republican congressman named Richard Kelly from Florida, one of the FBI agents said to one of the criminal division lawyers, "You can tell your Mr. Heymann that we got him a Republican." Well, needless to say, this did not sit that well on when the issue was political targeting, whether we had targeted anyone. But I have to say that if there was a serious profile in courage during the ABSCAM operation, when a middleman came in and claimed that he could bring in Peter Rodino to take a bribe on behalf of himself. And of course, that was the last person that we wanted to involve in this operation. At that time, Peter Rodino was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. He was the person in charge of the Department of Justice budget, and he had led the investigation into the impeachment of President Nixon during Watergate. And even though we did not relish the fallout that would occur if Rodino became involved, Phil, he did visibly gulp, but he didn't stop it. He let it go forward, and he applied the same standards as to everyone else. And that was, as long as he fully understood what was proposed and voluntarily entered, he wouldn't be off limits. Fortunately, the middleman's claim turned out to be false, and he never showed up. But we did get a lot of grief once it was ultimately revealed that we were willing to meet with him. Another inspiring performance occurred during ABSCAM, which the ABSCAM was revealed through leaks to the press. and the Senate Ethics Committee demanded that Phil and I appear at a late afternoon session, at which time they demanded the tapes of the meeting with Senator Harrison Williams. They claimed they needed the tapes to do an ethics investigation, but it was pretty obvious that they wanted the tapes to give them to Williams' defense lawyer to help him in the upcoming trial. And despite a barrage of demands and questions, Phil kept his cool, resisted their demands, and explained that we would provide the tapes and all the other evidence once the trial was completed. They kept us there till very late in the evening. When we finally left, we were standing at the Capitol waiting for a cab to take us back to the Department of Justice. Phil was totally unfazed by the verbal beating he had just taken, and he looked up at the beautiful Capitol dome, framed by a lovely spring star night, and he said, "Look at that sight, it's priceless." I was much more cynical, and after watching all these cash bribes on tape, said, "Priceless? At $50,000 times 435, you can own the joint." Well, after the unfortunate start in '78, as documented by Mr. Sapphire, I think that the relatively short time that Phil spent at the Criminal Division may rightly be viewed as its golden age. In addition to the abscam operation, which is the largest undercover public corruption operation in the department's history, and the success of Greylord and Brylab, which involved corrupt labor leaders, and many convictions of organized crime figures, we established lasting policies for the department, including the first written principles of federal prosecution. We established policies for the then recently enacted Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, established guidelines for future undercover operations, guidelines for the searches of newspaper offices, and drafted the so-called gray mail legislation that allows successful prosecution involving the misuse of classified information. Phil's short time as deputy in the Clinton administration under Janet Reno was not quite so successful. One thing that is not so well known is that back in 1980, when Phil headed the criminal division, there was a confrontation between DEA and the Miami Drug Police. The Miami police had run an undercover operation that allowed large quantities of marijuana to hit the street, and DEA was apoplectic about it, and the two drug units squared off with guns drawn against each side. This led to a meeting at which the head of the criminal division, our hero Phil, had to instruct the Miami district attorney that such practices had to cease, bringing the Miami DA to tears. That Miami DA was none other than Janet Reno, who never forgot that humiliation. And nor did Janet forget her experience at the Harvard Law School. Apparently, this law school, like many others, was not that kind to women in the early 60s when she attended. And the combination of those factors poisoned that relationship from the beginning. When Phil resigned, he put out a statement that said our management styles were too different to function effectively, and at the press conference he said our chemistry wasn't quite right. That kind of chemistry that wasn't quite right is sort of the same chemistry as between the Hatfields and McCoys, or Alan Dershowitz and Bill O'Reilly, or this school's graduate Ted Cruz and just about anybody else. At that same press conference, Phil was asked if he had any regrets during his 1 year as deputy, and he replied, "I should have rented instead of buying the house." Even though his tenure as deputy was short, his legacy at the department is lasting. He superbly handled the aftermath of the terrible events at Waco involving David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, the investigation of the tragic death of Vince Foster, and the appointment of Bob Fisk to investigate all of the Whitewater allegations. Once again, the team he assembled in that office not only performed admirably back then, but they have gone on to remarkable accomplishments as U.S. attorneys, judges, high-ranking officials in the Obama Department of Justice, state and local officials, and practicing lawyers. All of us who worked for him and the department itself are considerably better off because of the standards he set and the lessons he taught. We are all indebted to him, and we wish him all the best in his deserved retirement. Thank you. I didn't make it up.
Thank you.
So now we'll just have a few reflections from Phil, taking us back to how it all began and a few lessons he's learned along the way.
Excuse me. I asked each of the members of this panel, and I think Steve Breyer was asked too, to be disrespectful, to be mildly insulting. I did want them to be more than mildly insulting. And each of them has flagrantly violated my directive. So I take it it's left to me to give you a feel of what it was like at the start. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you what one of the stories that will go into this little book of 10-page stories would look like. And this is one where I teach surveillance now. This is one where I stopped a dumb surveillance program run by J. Edgar Hoover completely by mistake. I just didn't know what I was doing well enough. And I was tripped over the furniture in a darkened room, and J. Edgar Hoover fell down. Okay. It's 1966. I was 33 and had moved to the State Department from the SG's office. 6 months later, my boss, the very liberal Abba Schwartz, was reorganized out of his job in a secret cabal of the very conservative, communist-fearing right. The concerns about foreign influences and people were much like today, and in due course, I was appointed the acting director of the Bureau of Security and Consular Affairs in the State Department when no one else wanted the job. The reason no one else wanted the job should have been obvious to me. The Bureau was charged with supervising a very unsupervisable set of operating units. The Passport Office was headed by an extremely conservative, fanatically anti-communist named Francis Knight, who someone earlier described, I guess Juliette earlier described, as the J. Edgar Hoover of foreign travel. She had on her desk a red phone with a direct connection to J. Edgar Hoover's desk. She had another red phone on the other side of the desk with a direct connection to the CIA director, who I guess was Alan Dulles at the time. Another office was headed by an ex-FBI officer who, this was the visa office. The third office was headed by a former president of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, who was then responsible for worrying about Americans who were in trouble abroad. Mistakes could be made even there. I mean, everything was not always smooth. At one point, 2 Americans died about the same time abroad, and we had shipped the 2 bodies, as was part of our responsibilities, but by mistake we shipped them each to the other's home. The closed casket burial of one went fine. The open casket viewing of the other caused a local scandal. I was off to a great start. Each of these offices had political muscle and very large staffs. I had no political muscle and a small staff of about 5. My somewhat successful effort to end J. Edgar Hoover's useless but frightening surveillance of Americans abroad, another issue still with us a half century later, all began soon after I took over the Bureau and promptly discovered that my passport office, now I was responsible for it, was sending out requests to our embassies to report back on any news they picked up on the activities of particular people, including, for example, and this was the example, Stuart Hughes, a leftish Harvard history professor who was the grandson of Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes and had run against Ted Kennedy for the Senate in 1962 and lost. I felt my liberal values required me to stop this surveillance as an intrusion on the freedom of Americans to travel in privacy. I wasn't completely naive. I checked the file and found that there was no request from the FBI for information on Hughes. That was important because I wasn't anxious to begin my new political life in a fight with the right-wing protector of our security, J. Edgar Hoover, protector against gangsters and communists. Hoover had become one of the best known of Washington's dark powers in a 50-year career, and he benefited from a cadre of frightened presidents and members of Congress. In any event, I saw no reason to do battle with the FBI. I thought this case involved no more than that the Passport Office itself should not be taking on itself to become an investigative agency. We issued passports. We weren't an investigative agency. So I sent a memo to Frances Knight dealing only with what had to be resolved in this case, telling her not to engage in any form of surveillance of Americans traveling abroad. And then I probably underlined this, unless the FBI had requested it. More wisdom than boldness at that point, shown by me. I thought I was adding to the wisdom by improperly classifying the memo confidential to prevent Frances Knight, who was in a very public war with her more liberal bosses and the State Department, from leaking it to the press. It's the dumbest, prosaic, bureaucratic memo you ever saw, but it told her, don't do it anymore. Needless to say, I was very proud of how effectively I had handled the matter. Then the whole thing blew up into a nationally watched post-Joe McCarthy contest between the paranoid left and the demented right, combined with many slapstick touches. First, a liberal lawyer in another division, the legal division of the State Department, gave the telegram asking for information about Stuart Hughes to a reporter for the New York Times, who took it directly to Bill Moyers, the press secretary at Lyndon Johnson's White House. The reporter asked Moyers if this was a sign that with the assassination of John Kennedy, the Lyndon Johnson administration was moving sharply to the anti-communist right. Moyers knew nothing about it, so he called up the Deputy Secretary of State, George Ball, and talked to his senior assistant, George Springsteen, a very tough guy. Springsteen called me up and said, "Heymann, what are you doing down there?" I promptly and proudly responded that I had the matter well in hand, George. I said I had by then revoked the request for information, and I had directed Knight in writing that we should never conduct surveillance without a request from the FBI. The tough executive assistant Springsteen asked for a copy of the memo and sent it to Bill Moyers, who apparently shared it with the New York Times reporter. Meanwhile, the Times made clear that they were working on this story about a revived conflict between civil libertarians, led for the moment by an unwilling me, and rabid anti-communists. 2 weeks later, Frances Knight called up and said she had in fact found a request from the FBI. I don't know what the red phone had to do with it or didn't have to do with it, but it appeared. By then, the New York Times had already written its story about the ferocious director of the Passport Office being tamed by a brave 33-year-old lawyer. Miss Knight felt humiliated by a story about being ordered by a whiz kid half her age to change her practices, and she didn't remotely believe I was innocent of leaking this story to the press. She knew I had leaked it to the press, something I wouldn't have done and didn't do. She called a press conference and denounced me and the State Department, particularly for leaking classified documents in time of war when our soldiers were dying in Vietnam. This said, when do you get a letter of the first party to a third party, do not request, it was pure bureaucratese. But she played it up as the equivalent of revealing state secrets to an enemy in time of war. The story of reignited conflict between liberals and anti-communists in the aftermath of Joe McCarthy was soon carried on the front pages of newspapers throughout the country. My wife, Anne, describes, if I gave her a chance, would describe I don't think it's true, my parents in Pittsburgh, whom we were visiting, answering a constant ringing phone and denying that I was there or that they were related to their son. The following day, in the department's daily press conference, I'm not in trouble yet, okay. Following day, in the department's daily press conference, the New York Times reporter who had obtained the story said he was somewhat baffled by the fact that the now famous classified memo telling Frances Knight not to seek information on any American traveling abroad unless the FBI had requested it, was apparently requested by an FBI agent. because we dutifully reported that there was a request, found weeks late. How could that be? The reporter went on to speculate that perhaps the extremely courageous young man had meant that he would decide which of J. Edgar Hoover's requests would be honored and which wouldn't. That would make sense of it all. And that Mr. Heymann would henceforth carefully review the director's requests for surveillance. The State Department press spokesman grabbed onto the idea, suggested by the New York Times reporter, that this was not all a big botch-up by a beginner, but was really a carefully planned initiative by a savvy young acting administrator of the Bureau of Security and Consular Affairs. The press guy said, "Yes, that's exactly what Mr. Heymann plans to do. He will decide when Hoover's requests will be honored and when they won't." When I later got my Freedom of Information Act file from the FBI, there was a handwritten note, I think by the director, saying that he wanted to know, who is this person and why is he doing this to me? It was followed in a couple of days by a note from Hoover to the Secretary of State insisting that I be fired. When Secretary Rusk ignored the suggestion, Hoover announced publicly that he would no longer request the assistance. I'm about to stop a dumb, useless, and unwise surveillance program. Hoover announced that he would, announced publicly he would no longer request the assistance of such a leaky boat as the State Department in fighting subversion. And for a couple of years, there were no further requests. Okay. Now, when I came to teach at Harvard, that was the first case that we wrote up. That was, the Kennedy School probably has 2,000 or 3,000 political cases now. This is number one. Well, what could I learn from it? Where did this leave me, and what had I learned? I had completely by mistake found myself challenging J. Edgar Hoover when I carefully planned to avoid challenging him. Stumbling along with the help of a misclassified memo, I had knocked over and ended a stupid, secret, unworthy form of surveillance arrived at between the FBI and the Passport Office. Right-wing nuts from top to bottom. What I had learned is that unless I could understand a far more intricate web of relationships, obligations, laws, responsibilities, constituencies, and morality than ever appeared in appellate litigation, I was going to continue to stumble into dangers and miss opportunities that I had no way of suspecting were there. When the secretary declined to fire me, I was launched into a new type of career at the border where law meets politics, a career for which I would still need much education. By mistake, I had made something happen. It was something that was good for the country. Now I wanted to explore what it takes to do that intentionally. Pause. I want to just give you a quick sense of it, and then it ends up that I start teaching cases, and for the next 20 or 30 years, I'm teaching them to a bunch of students. Just consider just two of the things that I hadn't recognized that would be obvious to a pro. Every time I teach it, I would learn more. The first is the role of quite personal understandings of the situation, that everybody is in a different situation in the government, and if you want to predict how they'll act, you have to think about how it looks to them from their situation. I hadn't even tried to get into the minds of people far enough. I had gone and tried to convince Frances Knight that I had not purposely leaked a memo humiliating her. Frances Knight couldn't and wouldn't believe this because my predecessor and she had been at each other's throats for 5 years, and I had been invited in by her predecessor. I hadn't thought of it from her point of view. I thought I would go up and I would talk to her honestly, face to face, and I'd say, "Frances, I hope you don't believe I had anything to do with leaking this document." And to my surprise, she said, "Oh no, Mr. Heymann, how could I imagine you had anything to do with leaking this document? I never thought that for a minute, nor will I say that to my press conference this afternoon. It's been nice seeing you." Okay. For Senator Kennedy, a surveillance of his just prior opponent Professor Hughes was an irresistible opportunity to graciously but powerfully defend liberalism in the person of Professor Stuart Hughes, who had just run against him. I had never, if I'd thought about it a little, I would have thought that's what Kennedy's going to feel like. And how about Lyndon Johnson? President Johnson would see this as important mainly for his claim to be a liberal president after the assassination of President Kennedy. President Kennedy was a great martyr, he wrote to liberals whose support Johnson wanted. Johnson would have no interest in fighting a Kennedy over a stupid and ineffectual, somewhat paranoid surveillance program. I should have been able to see from the beginning that I was going to win without worrying about stumbling on the way. Well, what about Hoover? He'd call up and he would, this is the second point, less interesting. He would call up and he would tell Rusk to fire me. Well, people exercise influence one-on-one. There's only about 5 or 6 ways that you can influence another person in government. You can exercise authority. Hoover had no authority over Dean Rusk. You can persuade, but to persuade you have to have trust and knowledge. And Rusk didn't believe that Hoover could be trusted and had knowledge. You can bargain or invite reciprocity. Hoover had nothing that Rusk wanted. There was nothing there for him. You can rely on loyalty or friendship. They had no relationship. You can rely on moral authority, and Hoover wasn't a symbol of moral authority. I could have predicted that Rusk would back me up. When President Nixon took office, Dean Bok asked me to come teach at Harvard. I had agreed to teach criminal law, but what else? My answer was that I wanted to teach decision-making in government. I had by then participated enough and observed enough to bet that I could organize the subject of collective choice in the executive branch in a way no one had before. And that would be fun, intellectually exciting, and empowering to our students. And even talking about political mistakes or misadventures would convey the excitement of a group working together to make good things happen, despite the inertia and self-interest built into politics. Bok suggested that I join with a stellar group then forming the Kennedy School of Government, and Larry Tribe and I both joined with them. They were Nobel Prize-winning economists, the finest expert on bargaining theory and decision theory, Howard Rafa, Fred Mosteller, one of the greatest statisticians of the last half century, Dick Neustadt, one of the greatest political scientists. And Bok made that happen. He said, I think we ought to be looking at the law school to see what they're doing. And I'd love it if you went over and participated in setting up the Kennedy School. And he made that happen, and I went over, and Larry and I taught a monster course with all of them coming in. And I started the case program over there. And the first case was the case of J. Edgar Hoover. Thank you. I had meant to say at the beginning that we lost a wonderful professor, a wonderful man, Victor Brudney, who could tell the same kind of stories for a long time because of his experience during the Second World War. Victor died at the young age of 98 yesterday, and he was a wonderful man. Martha paid to have Richard Parker and I interview him at great length about his life, and we gave that to his children, and we're going to miss him very much. Thank you.
So just one last story before we adjourn. You know, it's true, Phil did give me strict orders that this event should be, in his words, I think, raucous and disrespectful. And I think we've kind of fallen down on the job a little bit. And now I'm going to just chuck it because this is not going to be in the least raucous and disrespectful. The story I want to share is actually a serious personal story. It's not a story I vetted with Phil because he would have nixed it. And in fact, he may not even remember it. But about 2 decades ago, I had a lunch with Phil. We were scheduled to have lunch to discuss some law school business. I don't remember what that was. But I had just a few months previously had my second child, and my husband and I had just learned that that baby had some serious health issues. And I came to lunch with Phil, and he just asked me perfunctorily, what was going on, how I was doing. And I couldn't help it. My eyes filled with tears, and I had not planned on saying anything, but I told him what was going on. And I should just say that baby is now 18 years old, doing great, going off to college, so nice end to that story. But at the time, it was really a harrowing and uncertain time. And as anyone who's ever been in a situation like that knows, it's very hard for people to know what to say to you. And even very well-meaning people can say the wrong thing or say something that makes you feel better. And I wish I could remember exactly what Phil said to me that day. I'm sure Phil doesn't remember. I don't remember either. But I do remember he responded with such instinctive kindness and gentleness. It helped me so much. And, we are all so proud of all your many accomplishments in government, and we are so appreciative of all the great things you've done here at Harvard. But, we're all really grateful for having had such a mensch among us for so many years. So now I ask everyone to come join us in a reception where we can lift a glass to our very beloved colleague and friend.